it's a wild episode. Like if you're a law nerd, it's a wild episode.
Yeah.
And like, it's like, yes, of course, Parliament can do this, but Quebec, you go do your thing. Basically, like Quebec, you're unrestrained until Parliament passes this law. Everyone else in the country is restrained by the original total ban. And man, anyway.
So when Carter came out, Daniel, where were you at in your educational journey? Were you in university at that point?
I was in a gap year, so just finished high school. But it is interesting. I had paid attention to politics a little bit through high school, but not as fully as later on. So in kind of my experience being closely connected to politics, euthanasia has kind of always been legal in Canada.
Right. Yeah. And for me, it was an important case in law school in that in 1993, the Supreme Court, a divided Supreme Court, but the majority upheld the complete prohibition on assisted suicide or euthanasia. And then in 2011, a lower court ruled that euthanasia could be permitted in Miss Taylor's case. So the case is called Carter, but Miss Taylor was actually the one of the applicants who had ALS. And so that became an important case of when can a lower court not follow a Supreme Court judgment. Obviously, they're supposed to. And the Court of Appeal then corrected the lower court and said you should have stuck with Carter. And interestingly, the Supreme Court then came around and said, well, the facts have changed, right? At the time, Rodriguez, there was no country that had legal euthanasia. The judge was right to account for the fact that there are countries with legal euthanasia. We can look at the evidence of how that's gone. And so the court basically opened it up for a lower court to say, well, based on new, what they called social and legislative facts, we can go a different direction and not follow Supreme Court precedent. And obviously, ultimately, the Supreme Court overturns its own precedent.
Mm-hmm. So maybe just for those who are watching who don't know the whole timeline of this, can you give kind of a high level, like what's the timeline? How did we get to that point? You've touched on a few of the points, but
sure. So I think starting in the 90s, there's and into the 2000s, I think there's a dozen or so bills that get overwhelmingly voted down in Parliament to legalize euthanasia. And as you might have predicted on an issue like this, it was likely to happen through the courts. I mentioned the 1993 Supreme Court decision upholding the law against a legal challenge there. But then a group of people, so Miss Carter is the name for the family member of someone who had traveled to Switzerland and was euthanized there. And so they were an applicant saying, in theory, at least they could be prosecuted for helping their family member do that. Miss Taylor in the Carter case had ALS, so that was expected, of course, to cause her death and kind of progressive disability. And that case, initially, the lower court said that she could be euthanized, and that was in 2011. The lower court judgment actually said she has to be very near death before the doctor is allowed to do that. We're a long way from that now. But that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which ruled in 2015 that the complete prohibition on euthanasia was constitutionally invalid. And it wasn't until 2016 that judgment actually took effect, and we got the first statute legalizing euthanasia in Canada in 2016.
Okay. So at that time, like I remember also just hearing the cultural shift almost over the radio, listening to people talking on talk shows. And that was really, it was cases like that, or extreme cases like people suffering from ALS or, where their death is imminent. That was what shaped the conversation at that time. So I don't know if maybe Daniel, you can talk to that, but sort of what was the starting point for some of those conversations, and how did we end up where we are now? Like, how did it get from there, what seemed to be a fairly limited number of cases, to where we are now?
Yeah, I think it started at the point where, many Canadians are most comfortable with is kind of, you think of stage 4 cancer, you think of ALS, you think of some of these horrible illnesses, which of course, we would say shouldn't qualify for euthanasia. Mm-hmm. But this idea of extreme suffering and euthanasia is the last resort. We've tried everything else. We've tried to alleviate pain. We've tried to resolve whatever. We've tried to treat the cancer, whatever the case may be. And euthanasia is the last resort. There's nothing else medically that can be done. And that's, I think, the way some people in Canada still try to think about it. It's like it should be a last resort, but it's very quickly become obvious that it's not a last resort, especially when, nearly 1 in 20 deaths in Canada are because of euthanasia now.
There's a saying that hard facts make bad law, and a court kind of has the luxury, probably isn't the right word, but the way a court approaches a problem is, this is the person before us, and are we going to tell that person based on what they're going through? And if I was in that person's shoes, that no, you cannot have this escape hatch from what seems to be likely to be kind of a frightening and prolonged dying process. And the court can just rule on that. But what Parliament, of course, is responsible for is to say, what role does the law have in society, in shaping societal attitudes towards suicide and obviously homicide with consent and the idea of a life that's no longer worthy to be lived. There's so many, it's so much more complex than just saying to this one person whether they can or cannot have their doctor hasten or directly cause their death.
And I guess that's the biggest issue here, right? Is that it's so difficult to measure the foundational change in society when you start to say, okay, we're going to measure some lives in a different way than we measure other lives, right? That your life, we're gonna decide whether it's disability, whether it's mental health, whatever the case might be, that's a good enough reason for you to end your life. And yet somebody's totally able-bodied, there still seems to be a stigma against, okay, no, there's suicide prevention is the first resort, right? Maybe talk to that and how that's changed even over the last couple of years. To where we're in a place now where people with disabilities are able to access euthanasia.
There's this kind of equating dignity with ability. So dying with dignity, of course, is one of the activist organizations that is pushing for radical expansion of euthanasia, and it's this idea that you only live a dignified life if you're still able to do your daily activities, still able to do what you want to do. And then as soon as you're not able to do that, then you need a so-called dignified death, which is to them euthanasia. It just points to this. It's one of the highest cited reasons for suffering now, according to Health Canada's latest report, is a so-called loss of dignity. And these people are starting to think, oh, I have this condition that qualifies me for euthanasia, so I must have lost my dignity in some way, and now need a so-called dignified death.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that these expansions, especially the last couple of years, and we could touch on exactly how that's happened from Carter till now, but obviously Canada's kind of becoming an international, is getting notoriety in some ways for doing that. But do you think that these expansions were what they expected at the beginning? Does it align with kind of where the original arguments were being made about euthanasia, or is this blown beyond what maybe the original intent of the law was, or the intent of the court decision even?
I think it's likely that at least some of the judges on the Supreme Court did not expect us to go this far, this fast. I think that's part of the reason it was a unanimous judgment. And the court frames its judgment to say, this judgment is about Miss Taylor and people in Miss Taylor's position. It contemplates, it talks about the evidence of the risks of legalizing assisted suicide. But it says, look, we're talking about these limited situations. They're contemplating, I think, what they refer to as it's strict, narrow exceptions to the general rule that we don't euthanize people. And so that's kind of they actually specifically mentioned, you're bringing evidence about Belgium and these kinds of things. We're not talking about made for mental illness or for minors. That's not what this case is about. So I think in the original judgment, it was clear the court had in mind end-of-life decision-making. In fact, they actually explicitly compare it to that. If you're withdrawing life support knowing the patient's going to die, isn't that kind of like euthanizing the patient? I mean, these are all parts of the Carter decision. So I think it's fair to say that at least the court thought it was doing something somewhat more conservative than what we've seen. But obviously later on, this kind of core logic of it being a right and a choice that people ought to be able to make, even lower courts pick up on that in subsequent cases and expand it.
Well, I remember actually, again, going back to that same sitting in the courtroom in the Supreme Court when they were having that conversation, and there was an interaction with Justice Moldaver where he basically said, no, we've created the ceiling that that's supposed to contain, the euthanasia practices in this country. And the lawyer responded to him and said, no, you've created the floor. This is the starting point, right? And he was off camera, just the way it was showing in the recording. But in the room, you could see he kind of like bounced back in his chair, like, what did we just do here, right? Like, and it's unfortunate that they didn't see that at the time. And now, obviously, we've had to deal with the consequences of that for the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. Maybe, Daniel, I don't know if you have some of the statistics in front of you now in terms of, the most recent report came out from I think it was the 2023 statistics, right? What's changed there? Do you see any patterns in terms of increasing numbers of euthanasia deaths, or people on the track 2 side of it, those with mental illness, those, whose death is not imminent, I suppose? What's that looking like for 2023?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers overall are continuing to grow. I mean, the few years before, it had kind of been about a 30% increase rate. In 2023, down to 18, but still significant.
That's 18% on a bigger number.
18% on a bigger number, yeah. And over 15,000 euthanasia deaths in Canada in 1 year alone. And like I mentioned before, almost 5% of all deaths in the country are because of euthanasia. So a continued rapid expansion. You see that expansion happening in track 2 more specifically now. Still a fairly small number. I think it's 600 and something people in 2023 died on track 2, which is where death is not reasonably foreseeable. But again, a year over year increase there. And increases in some of the, some very concerning reasons why people might be choosing euthanasia as well.
Mm-hmm. Can you just clarify on the track 2 thing, like what the timeline was there? Because that originally C-14 was kind of the government's response to the Carter decision, right? That was the Liberal government's response anyway. But then a couple of years later, they introduced C7. I think it was in 2020, right? And then the COVID situation happened, and then it got delayed.
I think it was 2019, and it came into effect in 2020. Is that roughly?
It passed in early 2021.
I think it was a bit later than that. Yeah.
Truchon was 2019, I think. But the initial legislative response. So Carter was decided under the Harper government. Yeah. The Harper government didn't legislate in the months it had left in government. Then there was the election. We had the Liberal government. The Liberal government tabled Bill C-14, which had the reasonably foreseeable natural death criterion. It wasn't defined, right? It didn't say 6 months as Oregon's law and the bill before the UK Parliament say 6 months, but it just left it open. Some doctors interpreted it fairly liberally, very liberally, in fact, but it was at least clear this is for people who are dying, whose condition can be expected to cause their death in the future. A Quebec lower court judge said, if we just kind of abstract part of Carter, the part about choosing to end your suffering, being connected to your liberty, right, and so on, that is a reason to strike down the reasonably foreseeable natural death requirement. The Trudeau government, specifically Justice Minister, Attorney General David Lametti, decided not to appeal that ruling and basically used it as a pretext to introduce, to remove the reasonably foreseeable natural death requirement.
He was happy with the ruling. Like, in many ways, this was a minister who was an activist, right? Like, he was trying to, just from conversations he was having with the media or podcasts or whatever, I think it was clear that he was on the pro-euthanasia, expand this thing further.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting political story in that he's one of the few Liberal MPs to vote against Jody Wilson-Raybould's, when she was Justice Minister, the initial legislative response saying it was too strict, despite how flexible reasonably foreseeable natural death is. And then he ends up Justice Minister. He ends up not appealing the case, liberalizing the law. And she, by that point, as an independent MP, votes against his bill to expand it. She was quite concerned that the law was going too far.
Too far, yeah. Interesting how that all goes and how that changed, because Jody Wilson-Raybould, that whole scenario, like she was clearly trying to do her best to limit it. I think she had personal concerns about how far it could go, but that just, I don't know whether it was the political scenario or whatever at that time, but the public pressure was there to expand further, I think. So why, maybe this is just speculative, but why has that changed all of a sudden? Why does it seem like there's more public pressure to say, okay, we've gone too far now? Again, maybe that's speculative, but
Yeah, I think our knowledge about public opinion, it's with the nuances of this policy issue. Generally, you can speak to that, whether Canadians support euthanasia. Generally, it seems that they do, right? But it gets a lot more complicated once you get kind of beyond that basic question of whether there's some level of support for euthanasia, at least in some form.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the majority, polls show at least, that the majority of Canadians support our original law. They support our current law. But I think when it gets into some of the examples, like some of the things that we've seen, stories in the media, some of the things that it's like, this is actually what the euthanasia law in Canada is doing, that's when people start having reservations. And there's been quite a few stories like that over the last couple of years. Veterans calling Veterans Affairs Canada and being offered euthanasia as a solution to their problems. You have examples now of people with mental illness. There was a woman in BC who went into a hospital with she was depressed, she was feeling suicidal, so she went to find help, and someone offered her euthanasia. And I think it's stories like that really make people take pause and think, well, maybe we have gone too far. Maybe we have gone down the slippery slope.
Well, it's kind of like what John was saying about when you kind of take that particular person's case and then make a law based off of that, right? You start forgetting about, okay, well, how does this actually impact those people in the same position in life who don't want to end their lives? And that's kind of the problem I think people are starting to realize. And I mean, the one Veterans Affairs case specifically that I can remember seeing on, I think it was on, anyway, wherever it was, CBC News or something. A lady she was a veteran, she was, I think, a Paralympian even, and was in a wheelchair. And so she had called Veterans Affairs because she needed a new wheelchair and she had been on a long extended waiting list. And somehow the guy on the other end of the line got to the point of like, you realize, MAID is an option for you as well, right? Like as if that was his duty to share all the possible options, including ending her life with her. And that's purely because she had a disability, right? So obviously, and rightly so, there was a lot of public pushback against that. But it's those kinds of stories, I think, like you're saying, that people are starting to realize, okay, hey, what would I do in that situation? It's one thing to say, yeah, I need the right to choose when I'm stuck in a corner. But what about those people who, yeah, like you say, they're in a vulnerable place already and they're looking to preserve their life and to stay alive? That seems to be the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and this was true when C7 passed already, but since then the disability community has basically been unanimously opposed to euthanasia for people with disabilities because they know that their lives are at risk now. They can go into a doctor's office or a hospital, and if they're in a wheelchair, that right away means you're eligible for euthanasia. Mm-hmm. And
it's a different standard of care almost, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's alarming. And I think it ought to be alarming for us. So I mentioned earlier about the fact that the international community is starting to take note of this. What do you think the reason is for that? Like, why are other countries concerned or sort of seeing Canada as a bad example? I mean, if it's a bit all over the place because the UK, obviously, they just recently had that vote on allowing euthanasia in the country, and that's kind of an ongoing debate there. But what is it about Canada's particular situation that's raising alarm bells around the world?
The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities noted, based on her basically study of what was going on in Canada, that a number of persons with disabilities had been seeking and receiving euthanasia based on a lack of social supports, based on basically despair that they would ever get the care and support that they needed. And also that people had been offered euthanasia in circumstances that were inappropriate and in ways subtly or not so subtly pressured to consider it. And I think that the idea that it's this purely autonomous choice, we're filtering out the vulnerable people, that started to look more and more like a myth. And one of the early criticisms of Carter from medical ethicists and others was this kind of fiction that we can say, well, we'll protect the vulnerable, we'll only find people who kind of have this rational wish to end their lives. It's this kind of autonomous, rational choice. And the reality is we're much more complex than that. Whether we decide our life should end, whether we're choosing, even if someone says, I want to end my life, how profoundly socially influenced we are, and even others' attitudes towards people who may be considering euthanasia, right? Is it, as a good Canadian, do you support them in that? Do you say it's your choice, I'll support you? Or do we say this person desperately needs help, they're thinking about ending their own life? I mean, how do we respond to that? It's much more complex than just, we'll filter out the vulnerable people, we'll make sure it's always a rational choice.
Mm-hmm. It's an attempt to be very clinical with it, when, like you say, the reality is that our relationships are a spider web of interconnectivity, right? And so when one thing happens in one area, it affects everyone else. And I think part of the concern too is, and maybe some of the stories that people were hearing was, what happens when family members start pressuring somebody for financial reasons or for whatever it might, even just the burden of care, right? That taking care of someone who's in a position, who has a disability or maybe old age or whatever the case might be, the incentives to then put that pressure on the individual. There's a risk there, I think, right, that we don't take into account when we're only considering that one individual's request.
Yeah, and there's a couple statistics from the latest Health Canada report too that are alarming in that regard. For example, people who receive euthanasia list their reasons for suffering, and they can pick multiple reasons. Right. And one of the 21% of people who were euthanized in 2023 cited isolation and loneliness as a reason. But nearly half of them cited that they felt like a burden on family or friends or caregivers. And I think there's this culture of, you qualify for euthanasia, so you should probably think about it. In itself makes people consider it and perhaps makes them feel like a burden. But then there's also potential pressures from other specific people in their lives as well.
I think that raises something that probably a lot of people might not be aware of, is just how important psychological suffering, loneliness, and so on is in choosing euthanasia. You might say, well, wasn't this about physical illness? Isn't mental illness still not a reason you can get euthanasia? And the answer is, mental illness alone can't qualify you for euthanasia yet. That's to come into effect in 2027 unless we change that. Yep. But the way the law is written is, physical or psychological suffering is one thing that makes you eligible. You also have to have a disease or disability. So the question is, can you connect the psychological suffering to your disease or disability? So if you're depressed, are you depressed about the fact that you got paralyzed in that car accident? Yes, now you're eligible. So we are doing euthanasia for mental illness. We're just only doing euthanasia for mental illnesses of people with disabilities as well. So that's that discrimination piece that Daniel raised earlier as well, about we're not protecting or valuing disabled people's lives as much, because the depressed, able-bodied person, or
even somebody who's already has suicidal ideation or something like that, right? And this was the case with that Veterans Affairs situation, was the case. And so when now somebody else is coming to you suggesting maybe you should end your life, it's like there's an additional, there's the additional pressure there, right? So where to from here, I guess? Like, do we see any hope or optimism? I mean, Canada's become kind of this internationally recognized problem case a little bit. Not that other countries don't have the same standards of law, but it just seems that single-handedly the Liberal government has managed to establish this euthanasia regime within Canada. Do you see any reason for optimism? Not in a partisan way per se, but just like in general, is there a hope of rolling any of this back, or pausing somewhere along the way, or what does that look like?
I think the situation is fairly bleak, the current picture, but I think there is some hope of positive developments. And we just saw the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, speaking in a news interview, saying, this euthanasia was intended to be an end of life option for those who would choose that as an alternative to prolonged dying process, and now it's an alternative to a difficult life. She basically seemed to say this is not what it was meant to be, and it shouldn't be that. Pierre Poilievre has spoken at least about he would not expand any further. He's against the and his party is against the certainly expanding it to mental health as the sole underlying condition. So at least we're seeing some indication that some politicians believe, some major political leaders believe it's gone too far. And so I would certainly hope that at least the mental health piece will be canceled. That scheduled 2027 extension will be canceled. Beyond that, I think it's up to Canadians to speak to their MPs, their candidates, and say, we need to do more than just stop the expansion, right? I mean, this law is lacking adequate oversight, safeguards. We're seeing that we need to actually reform and fix the current law because it's just very inadequate.
Mm-hmm. And that's the focus of the Care Not Kill campaign right now too, which previously it was focusing on mental illness because that was very, very relevant, but now being delayed, certainly still relevant, but just saying, hey, whoever the next government is, there's an election this year. Next government will have to deal with the mental illness piece because it's either going to come into effect or not in 2027, but they've got to do more than that and protect more Canadians, really as many as possible.
But I guess that's the optimistic part of it too, right? Is just seeing over the last couple of years since the activist David Lametti trying to sort of add that piece, the mental health piece, to the previous bill, and then the Senate added it obviously, and then the House supported it through him, I think. But to see that sunset clause continually being pushed off as Canadians spoke out about it, and I think through the Care Not Kill campaign and other efforts from other organizations to really say, okay, mental health is too far. Not that we don't believe the rest of it was too far, but just there was a turning point there, that it went much beyond what Canadians were anticipating. So in the future years, what's the push? Like we've talked about track 2. What are some opportunities for our supporters or others to get involved to support that effort?
I think there should be, I think for Canadians to express their opposition to euthanasia in principle and its entirety is still worth doing. Let your MP know that you're against this. I think in terms of more realistic policy goals, I think if you look at other jurisdictions that have legalized this, that they say this is an end of life option, right? If you are dying, if there's no prospect of your recovery, and you basically want an early exit from that, and that's a choice that obviously people will object to for ethical reasons. But if that's going to be the choice that we allow some people, then make sure it's only that, and you do that by saying your life the prospect should be that your life is going to end within 6 months. Give it a defined term. And that's something that Canada could still do, and I think should do. That's probably a more realistic policy goal. That would be huge. I mean, many people who are euthanized in this country would have longer than 6 months to live. And because of that, these are people that you can find real supports and meaningful care and other solutions for.
Mm-hmm. So one of the focuses of the Care Not Kill campaign is also on disability, right? On that aspect of it, and trying to see what we can do to try and roll that back. Do you see any hope for us being able to do that? I mean, there's an incremental approach here, right? Where we're saying, similar to our take on abortion, it's one step at a time, and we're sort of having to do the work of seeing what we can do to roll back C7, the second step in that, before we have an opportunity to move further. But that's kind of what the Care Not Kill campaign is focusing on right now, right?
Yeah, it's something that, certainly we're focusing on as ARPA, but there's a lot of other groups focusing on it as well. Groups that we align with very closely ideologically, but groups that we are very different from ideologically as well. So it's a pretty broad spectrum of Canadians that are saying this is too far, and asking our government, the various political parties, to roll that back. And I think after seeing how far euthanasia has come in the past couple of years, how far we've gone down the slippery slope, I think there are more Canadians every time a new story comes out that are recognizing this is too far and actually wanting to take some action about it. So, I guess my optimism is around the fact that there's such a broad range of Canadians that are saying we need to do something about this. And not just Canadians. We've mentioned international jurisdictions too that are saying, hey, Canada, what are you doing? Why are you almost the, one of the most progressive regimes in the world? And why are you close to being the country that kills the most people every year?
Mm-hmm. Any concluding thoughts? Anything we've missed touching on? 10 years is a long time, but it also feels like it's gone by just like that. Like in ARPA's priorities over the last 10 years, euthanasia has always been right at the top in terms of what we're trying to work to oppose. And I think that's going to be the case into the future as well, alongside other campaigns like the We Need a Law campaign, right, where seemingly culture is not in agreement with maybe some of the talking points and things like that. But I think here with this, in this issue, we have an opportunity. It's a live issue. And I think we have an opportunity to do some good, to see some legislative change, hopefully in the near future, both at the federal level and at the provincial level. So I think I agree with you in terms of the optimism. I think that's hopefully the message we can share with supporters too, is that there's room for work to be done. And now we just have to go do it and pray that God will bless that work too into the future.
Yeah.
All right.
I wish I hadn't opened my answer with, the situation is pretty bleak. I meant, in my head, I was thinking, our current law is pretty bleak.
Yeah.
But the opening line is like, the situation is pretty bleak. As if it's like, what can we do? What can we hope for in the future? Anyway.
But if
hopefully
it wasn't,
the next sentence makes it less pessimistic. But
if it wasn't for the current political situation, it could still look pretty bleak, right?
Yeah.
The reality is all the parliamentarians and all the current people sitting in both houses are
committed to expanding
just
it.
Driving it forward, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you ever remember when Mike and Jen had their time before the committee? It was the joint parliamentary committee that was considering the issue, and we've had lots of opportunities to speak to that committee, but that one in particular just struck me because they had a particular personal case they were talking about with the passing away of their son, that there was just, especially a couple of the senators just went after them, and it was just like, yeah, we get that you have this, you have your son and there was this situation, but ultimately we have the right to end our life the way we want. And it kind of struck me in that moment too. I remember talking about it after the fact, that it just seemed like this was a number of rich, well-to-do Canadians in a position where they had no pressures to decide how to end their life or what their life was going to look like, securing their future. It's their retirement plan almost, right?
Yeah.
And they didn't care who was going to be affected by it, whether somebody who's vulnerable, somebody with a disability, somebody in a minority community, whatever. Anyway.
Well, it's interesting too, because some of the doctors that are killing so many people through euthanasia too, I think there's almost a similar perspective there. It's like, I'm going to help other people. I'm going to help end their suffering, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. There was just, I think a couple weeks ago, there was a pro-euthanasia activist in the States that died in palliative care. And it's, he's killed so many people through assisted suicide, and yet he opts for palliative care as he's dying. Yeah. And I think it's just this. There's this fear of what life could look like when you're unable to do your daily activities or whatever. But when you get there, if there is adequate care, then that is makes it manageable.
Yeah,
it's interesting because you pointed to that fact yesterday, John, about the fact that palliative care doctors seem to be very much on the side of, euthanasia is not the answer. And you would think, working with people at end of life all the time, seeing potentially severe suffering at end of life, that they would be the ones more on the side saying, no, this needs to be an option. We need to have this in our hospices, in our palliative care units and things. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Mm-hmm.
They seem to understand. I mean, one, pain management has come a long way, right? So that's something we can certainly thank God for. But that I think they've also been witness to just how difficult but also meaningful a process that can be, right? Of going through the dying process with loved ones, and obviously with medical support as well. But yeah,
And there's a lot of doctors who really still do care about their patients. Like there's only 2,200 doctors in Canada who do euthanasia, 15,000 euthanasia deaths, which still that's a very large number, but that means there's a lot more doctors who haven't done euthanasia.
They haven't got involved, yeah.
by the way, medical assistance in dying, palliative care is the real medical assistance in dying. It's, they must be a little bit perturbed at how that that terminology has been taken over.
Well, it's a misnomer, really, right? And I think it confuses people. Like I've heard talking to one elderly person who thought when we were talking about medical assistance in dying that's what it was. It was like, yeah, of course I would like, medical assistance
Medical
at
care
the
through
time
dying
of my
process,
death.
Sure, yeah.
So it's just, it's sneaky in that sense, I think.
Yeah.
But, all right, well, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much for your time, and we'll see what the next 10 years brings.